I'm Kennedy Hall filling in for Mike, the King Dude Church, or the King Dude Mike Church, however you want to put his famous nickname here. He's on holiday this week. I'm filling in, as I said. At any time, if you'd like to call in, you can call in at 1-844-527-8723 and go to the Crusader Stadium chat room that's open for your commentary at crusadechannel.com/chat. If you're joining me on the Meaning of Catholic live stream, welcome. This is a free preview. So if you want to hear the second hour, we got a juicy story coming up the second hour. You got to sign up. Today, we're going to talk about Our Lady of Walsingham. Devoted listeners of the Crusade channel probably know a lot about that. But for those who have not, this is sort of a lesser-known apparition. We've got a novena that we're trying to start as a group here for the success of the Kennedy Profession, set to launch on July 19th. So you can actually go to my Twitter, and you can see it there. And I will post a link to that at some point in the description and chat of the live stream on Meaning of Catholic. We're sending out emails and so forth with that link. So Crusade channel subscribers, you'll get those. We're going to talk about Our Lady of Walsingham. And we're also going to talk about the Latin Mass, the potential restrictions on the Latin Mass. You've heard a lot about this, and I'm not going to go over the same opinions you've probably heard other places if you've been watching people like Taylor Marshall and so forth. But nonetheless, I think there's a link between this, let's say, English patrimony we have with this devotion to the Mother of God under the apparition of Our Lady of Walsingham, and also the restoration of the true Mass. For a little bit of background, if you don't know, there was a suppression of the Mass, not under the guise of the implementation of the Novus Ordo, like it was in the 1970s, but back in the time of Henry VIII, you obviously had a big change in the Reformation in England. And if you read a book called Cranmer's Godly Order by Michael Davies, it's one of the best books I've ever read, and it goes about the history of what happened in England in that hallowed period there. And in fact, I was reading through that book, and there were times where it struck me, and I thought, my goodness, does this sound like the 1970s, or does this sound like the Great Repression of the Mass under the Anglican so-called Reformation? I'm Kennedy Hall filling in for the King Dude Mike Church, who's on holiday this week, as I said. Again, you can call in 1-844-527-8723. And if you are watching on the live stream on the Twitter or on the YouTubes, I sound like I'm a 55, 67-year-old. Actually, I don't want to say that because I think that I'm going to be aging some of my friends there. I sound really old saying on the Twitter, on the YouTube, on the Facebook, etc. In any case, this is the Crusade channel, the last live radio station standing. Always on air and always online at crusadechannel.com. And if you have not visited the Founders Trading Post, you can actually find some of my books for sale there. But you can also find some of the best cigars outside of the trade embargo with Cuba. If you go to the Founders Trading Post, go to mikechurch.com/shop. You can find merchandise to help out this channel and help out Catholic vendors in many cases. In any case, we're going to talk about Our Lady of Walsingham. So if you don't know, this is an apparition that happened in England. And I'm going to read here from a website called catholicinsight.com. I had never heard of this website before, but apparently it's Canadian. So once again, not only do you have good radio hosts and good maple syrup, but you also have sometimes good Catholic websites. So I'm going to read here about what happened there. So if you've heard of this story before, this will be a refresher. If you never have, then perhaps you can add this to your Marian devotions. I know in our house, we've got pictures and statues of Our Lady of Fatima and Our Lady of Guadalupe. We've also got one of Our Lady Mediatrix of All Graces in our bedroom. But we're sort of Guadalupe fans and Fatima fans here. That's sort of the big one for us. But we're going to add Our Lady of Walsingham to this because, especially for myself, coming from a Commonwealth country, there is something kind of special about this idea that there's this organic and ancient Marian devotion in England. And in fact, even the Anglican Church, as many faults as they have, even the Anglican Church has long recognized this devotion. So that's an interesting development. At any rate, this is the history of the apparition. In Norfolk in southeastern England, remained staunchly Catholic during the reformatory troubles begun by Henry VIII. The Dukes of Norfolk held fast to the faith through the travails of the Tudors, Henry and his daughter Elizabeth and son Edward, along with their successors. The 15th Duke of Norfolk, Henry Fitzalan Howard, provided much of the funds to build the Grand Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in the nearby city of Norwich. Of course, after the glorious 12th century medieval structure was adopted for Anglican services in the 16th century. It was in this region, rural and remote, insofar as anything in England is really remote. One is never more than 70 miles from the sea, regardless of where one goes. That's pretty amazing, actually. Half a millennium before the Reformation, Our Lady appeared to a noble woman, Richeldice de Faverches, sorry if I mispronounced that, in 1061, asking for an exact replica of the Holy House of Nazareth to be built. So we've got a mini Nazareth essentially being built in England. The house, a scant 26 by 13 feet, small is after all beautiful, and are not tiny homes making somewhat of a comeback, constructed apparently by miraculous means, soon attracted pilgrims from all over England and beyond. Miracles abounded, an impressive Augustinian abbey, anything but tiny, was soon built around the humble holy house, and the village of Walsingham grew. All that now remains of the abbey is an impressive arch. It's the ruins of the abbey that are still there, as is the case in a lot of places in England, Scotland, and so forth, offering some scale of its overwhelming size. As one local man mentioned, the small house symbolized Our Lady, the abbey her son, for she, the lowly handmaid, always points the way to Christ, the Alpha and Omega. Walsingham soon became one of the 4 great pilgrim sites of the Middle Ages, besides Jerusalem, Rome, and the shrine of Santiago de Compostela of the Spanish coast. That's interesting to think about. In those few hundred years preceding the Reformation, one of the 4 great pilgrimage sites was actually in England. We sometimes forget, because history's been rewritten so many times by this Anglican Protestant Reformation. England was Roman at one point and was eventually a staunch and very faithful Catholic country. And in fact, the first explorers that came to Canadian seas, Giovanni Gabotto, who was Italian but sailing on behalf of England, he brought priests and he brought the Catholic faith to Canada in 1495. So North America was first discovered in a sense by the Vikings, Leif Erikson, who himself was a Catholic and brought priests with him, and they actually planted vineyards. That's why it was called Vineland. So it's interesting to think about 1,000 years ago, the Vikings came over to Canada, or Newfoundland, that sort of area on the East Coast, the Northeast United States and Eastern Canada. And it's interesting to think that one of the crops that they planted were actually vineyards. So I like to think in that 150, 200-year period where there was a colony settlement there, Perhaps some of the first crops that were cultivated were actually used in the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Who knows? But maybe there's a sign of restoration in times to come, sort of a prophetic sign that Canada and Northeast United States were actually called Vineland because of the vines. And if you think of the imagery there with Christ talking about, all those sorts of things in the New Testament, it is interesting to think about the Catholic presence and the actual presence of vines, of the fruit of the vine being planted as the first among crops. It also shows you that there was a warming period then, and that was way before fossil fuels. Perhaps the Vikings were using electric Tesla-powered ships on their way over. Who knows? In any case, we'll continue with this Our Lady of Walsingham. At this time, a custom developed of walking the last holy mile to the shrine barefoot. A chapel was built at this starting point in the 14th century, where pilgrims could leave their shoes. Hence, it was customary. Its customary name is the Slipper Chapel. I never knew that. The only part of the shrine besides the arch that still stands to this day. Almost every monarch of England made a pilgrimage to Walsingham, and Edward the Confessor, who made the pilgrimage 11 times, offered the nation to Our Lady as her dowry. So England is Our Lady's dowry. I know Mike's talked about that before in the show. Henry VIII, who would later oversee its destruction, went there as a young monarch in 1511, trudging the last holy mile barefoot through the snow in thanksgiving for a son that had finally been born. The boy, alas, tragically died a few months afterward, and I, for one, wonder what this did to Henry's later fractious relationship with the church, even with God himself. That's actually interesting. There could be some sort of psychological beginning there, some psychological trauma. And so it was until the dissolution of the monasteries and Henry's rebellion against Rome and the church in 1535 over the question of his marriage, and the Pope's refusal of an annulment from Catherine so Henry could marry his paramour, Anne Boleyn, and also conveniently loot the church's wealth. The author says, the day I began writing this just across from the very site is providentially enough the 480th anniversary of the dissolution of Walsingham. On the morning of August 4th, 1538, John Petrie, the king's representative, rode defiantly into the abbey grounds on his horse, stepped off, and received the deed from the abbot giving order or giving over all the grounds and treasuries to the king. They melted all the precious vessels, the copper roof, the tin, the embroidery, anything to get their hands on. The precious statue of Our Lady was, according to some reports, dragged to the streets and burned, but recent evidence suggests that the real image survived. And the devotion to God's mother and England's spiritual queen. The agent responsible for the destruction and pilgrimage had to write down for his boss, Thomas Cromwell, the infamous. I cannot perceive, but the said image is not yet out of the sum of their heads. To this day, the image of Our Lady is still in the heads and hearts of many an Englishman and Catholic throughout the world. As I learned at a talk by Father Michael Rear, an Anglican convert and an expert in all things Walsingham, the abbot had appealed to Cromwell, invoking canon law, which to my happy surprise stipulated that an abbey was deemed no longer viable, must be turned into a college or a place of education. But Cromwell and his king were implacable. Looted and stripped, the abbey was left to ruin, the holy house abandoned, decaying to dust. Let's just think about that here for a second. Sometimes people will say, oh, the Anglican Reformation, that was essentially just sort of over marriage. Some people say, well, Anglicanism, it's the same. It's just about divorce. No. These are the beginnings of the Reformation in England. And it begins with an attack on the Mother of God. And this is something we see in all heresies. We saw this with the Nestorian controversy, where, yes, Our Lady is the mother of Jesus, but is she the mother of God? We have to have a proper Mariology, understanding of the Mother of God. If we don't, we end up having an improper Christology, understanding Christ and who he is. This is why we read in the Magnificat that her soul magnifies the Lord. The more clearly that you see the Blessed Mother, the more complete and more clear you see Jesus Christ, the Son of God. This is the way God ordained it. He will not have himself without his mother. Let's continue. Most of the monks signed the oath of the king's supremacy as head of the church, but their sad obeisance could not save the shrine. I say most, for the sub-prior and one other monk did not, and they were taken, convicted on flimsy and hearsay evidence of rebellion, confined to an underground dungeon in pitch darkness, where they spent the night in prayer, before being marched over to what is now known locally as Martyrs' Field. There's no sign or marking, just an abandoned grassy lot, where they were summarily hanged, hung. Well, it should be hanged. Sorry, the writer should be. I think it's hanged when you do actually an execution. Hanged, drawn, and quartered before a crowd of onlookers, many of them forced to be there to witness what would happen to traitors. Pause here for a second. So often we use the analogy of what happened in Nazi Germany, or we'll use the analogy of what happened in communist states. And people will say, well, how can so many good people get caught up in something so insane? Well, we saw this long before with the church heresies. These people who are crowds onlooking, I'm sure some of them are onlooking in disgust. But if you look at how many people sort of got swept up in the madness of the Reformation and in things, I mean, listen, it's one thing to be scared of your government. It's one thing to be scared of your government and say, well, the government's doing something crazy right now. Who am I to work against that? It's one thing to say that. But it's another thing to witness things like the destruction of a Marian shrine, essentially the killing of your mother. It's another thing to watch the killing of your spiritual mother and then to sort of jump on that bandwagon. That's a completely different animal. So we see evidence of people sort of flipping the switch, which we saw this last year. So many people just sort of fell in line, close my business, destroy my family, have my mother miss her cancer treatments. You've heard the story many times on here. All because of some insane idea that we just sort of had to fall in line and do this new heresy, this new social heresy, this socialist heresy of distancing and hand washing and so forth, this new pagan religion that we're going through. So we see the seeds of this in places. And what does that tell us? Well, that tells us that these major social heresies and these major, because in England, it was not just a religious heresy, it was a social heresy because there was an understanding of the kingship of Christ. It was an understanding of the kingship of Christ. So any heresy that affected the church was in fact a social heresy as well. It was something, was an error that spread through society, which changed the fabric of the way people live their lives. And it begins with a rejection of the Mother of God. It begins with not just a rejection, but an actual desecration of holy places. One of them, as we said, one of the four main Marian shrines on the continent of Europe, and also the island in England, not just on the continental side. That's pretty incredible. That's pretty incredible. So that tells us that that the restoration of our society can only begin with a devotion to the Blessed Mother. We see this with her apparitions throughout history. To my knowledge, there's nothing in the Our Lady of Walsingham apparition as we're understanding it today. There's nothing in it as far as the prophecies that we get with things like Our Lady of Good Success, Our Lady of La Salette, with Our Lady of Fatima, of course. There's nothing in the way of that, but the actual reality of what happened to this place is prophecy enough, in a sense. What we see is basically this Marian devotion. This place is destroyed as a result of this social heresy. So the way to reverse a social heresy is to, essentially recapture devotion to the Mother of God. That fits perfectly in line with everything that we've seen with Our Lady of La Salette, Our Lady of Good Success, and also with Our Lady of Fatima. So, continuing. The same grim fate awaited many residents of Walsingham, who even whispered thoughts of defiance against the Royal Highness. As Pope John Paul II said, and as the 20th century gave witness, totalitarianism will brook no defiance, as we to our dismay well discover once again. As a final affront, the humble statue of Our Lady of Walsingham, of which Erasmus wrote so movingly in his own pilgrimage, was consigned to flames at Chelsea later that September. Then again, as in the days of Roman persecution, sometimes the Catholics would provide fake holy objects for burning, keeping the real ones hidden. The shrine and abbey had been the main attraction and the primary employer of the village, hundreds dependent upon its income. After their destruction, Walsingham descended into poverty and neglect, a forgotten backwater village, the haunt of birds and owls, as the poems describing its laments. That is until the end of the 19th century, when an energetic Catholic convert from Anglicanism, Charlotte Boyd, purchased the land on which the Slipper Chapel still stood, and which her funds restored the place. And with her funds restored the place slowly but surely. It was not until after her death in 1906 that the chapel became a place of pilgrimage. Before that, pilgrims would go to the much more accessible King's Lynn as an alternative site. By 1934, Walsingham was declared the National Shrine of England once again. Popes ever since have approved Walsingham. A new statue was chosen by Leo XIII, a model of the original, known from an image that survived. Pope Pius XII had the statue solemnly crowned, and Pope John Paul II placed the statue on the altar for his outdoor mass on his own visit to England in 1982. Pope Francis, on 2015, raised the shrine to the status of a minor basilica. Pilgrims now flock to Walsingham in increasingly great numbers, in spite of, perhaps even because of, its remoteness and its primitive road system. To this pilgrim, behind its humble exterior, there is a great spiritual beauty and power waiting to be awakened in full glory, for those who have but eyes to see. Yet there is one missing bit in all this: the site of the Holy House itself, which Charlotte Boyd was not able to purchase and is still in private hands. One must pay to enter the ruins of the abbey and the place where the Holy House once stood. About £6 per person, not insignificant sum, especially for families. So Catholics gathered to pray at the Slipper Chapel and walk the Holy Mile into town, where at least they can get a glimpse of the original site through the grates of the still standing Pilgrim's Gate. So we should pray that the church may soon have the site of the Holy House once again, and the end, as well as the beginning of the pilgrimage, may be open to all and sundry. So that, as Leo XIII exhorted, or we hope prophesied, England may indeed return to Walsingham in all its former and present glory. And as Leo XIII promised, Our Lady returned to England once more. He said, the quote that I read from Leo XIII was that when England returns to Walsingham, Our Lady will return to England. What a beautiful thought. So what does this have to do with the traditional Latin Mass. Because I said at the beginning, we were going to talk about what does this have to do with traditional Latin Mass? Well, as I said, there is a link between what happened in England, or sorry, not a link, a similarity, let's say, what happened in England with the destruction of all that was sacred. And if you go read the early days of the Reformation in England, see, we have this idea again that the history books have been rewritten. We have this idea that essentially what happened in England was just sort of a theological difference. Sure, there was some political tensions. Yeah, things got out of hand, but they sort of retained the faith. That's not true. There were radical changes at the beginning. And if you read in Michael Davies' Cranmer's Godly Order, there were actual and legitimate and explicit and intentional desecrations of altars, of this belief in the real presence. It wasn't as if Anglicanism started as some sort of mild heresy where, again, it was just about the Pope, but they kept the... No, that's not what happened. In fact, it was explicit in the early days that there had to be this destruction of all popery, of all popishness, of all Catholicism, which means they went after what? They went after the Blessed Mother of God. They went after the Eucharist. They went after all of these things that they saw as idolatry and so forth. It took different manifestations in different parts of England. And later, things seem to have calmed down. But the beginning was really an anti-Catholic rebellion. It was a revolt against the faith. It was a revolt against the church. So we saw this after the Second Vatican Council. I heard stories from a friend of mine who I used to go to Mass with here. We go to the traditional Mass now, but the old Nova Sordo parish that we went to, good friend of mine still goes there, a very faithful man. And actually his wife does have cancer right now. So please pray for her. Her name is Rosa. Please pray for her. He was telling me about what had happened in the 1970s in their parish church, which I've been to before. It's still a very beautiful church, but of course the high altar's out and many of the statues removed. This church, it didn't just have beautiful statues. It didn't just have a beautiful altar. The entire church, if you looked up sort of the way that you see in the crest, the arc of the church, the entire church had this beautiful mosaic. This beautiful, if you think of the beautiful mosaics you've seen in various beautiful chapels around the world, we're talking world-class quality. And they just painted over it. It got to the point where the parishioners, even though they were generally accepting of the changes because they were just trying to be obedient to sort of the spirit of the times, they had to petition the priest to stop removing sacred things from the church. They thought, okay, I get it. You're changing the liturgy, but why do you have to get rid of all the statues? What does this idea of the Second Vatican Council have to do with getting rid of statues? Well, you see where the fruits of revolution, you see them coming to bloom. You see where those seeds were planted years before. And this sort of thing happened all over the place. There's even a rumor, although it's pretty substantiated, that the seminary where I'm from, there's even a rumor that basically they asked the Freemasons to come out and take the high altar out of the main cathedral. To this day, you can still find pieces, and I've talked to seminarians who have done this in the seminary. You can still find pieces of the destroyed high altar in the fields by the river in the city where the seminary is. So this sort of destruction is inherent in revolution. We see this today with our statues. It's not enough that they just disregard, but they have to destroy things. And there you see the true spirit of what is happening. And this sort of thing has happened in the church before. The iconoclasm of the early centuries of the church, with the Reformation, both on the continent and in the Anglican Isles area, the English Isles, British Isles. And we see this in the church after the Second Vatican Council. Okay, you change the liturgy. Again, why do you have to get rid of the statues? Why do you have to take out the high altars? The high altar never had to be taken out. And you see this in certain churches where they sort of stood their ground. There's a story from around here for a gentleman. He was an old Dutch Catholic. And he himself was of that generation who was very faithful. They were immigrants. They were farmers, and they built these churches. And it's a famous story to this day. And there's still one tiny little church around this county that I'm from, where essentially they sent the construction crews or whoever they were to come and get those altars out. and he wouldn't leave the church. It was kind of like when you hear about the hippies standing in front of a big red oak tree or whatever they are, and he won't leave, and the logging company has to make the decision not to cut it down because they can't kill the person who's chained himself to it. It was a similar sort of, it was a similar activity that this gentleman did, and he wouldn't let them take the high altar out because we understand inherently the spirit of something when we see the fruits of that thing. You know, we can say all we want about the Second Vatican Council not being implemented properly. Well, we see here the same thing about communism, don't we? But we can say the same thing about the Second Vatican Council not being implemented properly. But when we see what happened after that, whether it was the documents that told them to do that or not, that's not really the point. It's the whole spirit of the thing. And we saw precursors for this in England. They changed the liturgy into English. In some cases, they left parts of it in Latin. But it slowly changed into English. They took out the altars. They took out the statues. They desecrated the places. There are even stories, as I said, if you read Michael Davies' book, where they actually had dogs urinating on the various old altars to show that they were just idolatry, sort of popish, superstition, and that weren't even sacred at all. They took it to that extreme. And it begins, someone just said in the chat, the Celtic Isles. I apologize to all my, well, I'm not Irish, but if I were, I would apologize to all those Celtic people. Actually, one time I said that to Irish friends of mine. We were talking about rugby. As you know me, I talk about it all the time. And I said, what is it about these guys from the British Isles that are so tough? And they said, we're not from the British Isles. We're from Ireland. And I said, okay, I poked the hornet's nest. I apologize. So I apologize, Paddy McGill, if I said the wrong, if I sort of had an anti-Celtic slur by calling them the British Isles. Anyway, I'm not going to get into to that whole centuries, millennia-long dispute. And that's another thing as well. This is totally a side note. But when you hear all this talk of reparations, when you hear all this talk of, for example, here in Canada, we're on occupied land is what they'll say because it belonged to certain tribes before and so forth. A lot of that's very dubious because the history is very muddled. But the point is, why does everyone forget about the Irish? I mean, people forget all the time. If you are European and your bloodline is from Europe, did you know that you're an indigenous European? Seriously, if you follow the logic of that, meaning, from some time immemorial, your family has been on a certain piece of land. You're indigenous to that land. Europeans are indigenous people. You ever think about that? People who are Indian and from India are indigenous people. People who are from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and are sub-Saharan African, they're indigenous. Just because you're not of a different skin color, if your bloodline goes back to time immemorial, you're indigenous to that land. Italians are indigenous Italians. So why do the Irish not get to claim? And I'm not saying that we should be claiming for reparations, but I'm saying look at what they went through. The English were terrible to them. Talk about ethnic cleansing. If anyone has any claim to a centuries-long debacle that sort of sought to destroy a culture and heritage and language and religion and so forth, it's the Irish. Maybe that's why they have so many sad drinking songs. In any case, so let's get to this article where it's from Claire Chrétien. I don't think she's Canadian, but anyway, she has a French name. She writes for, I've talked to her before at LifeSite for the articles that I've written, but she said how bishops restrict and subvert the traditional Latin Mass despite Summorum Pontificum. Basically, the theme of the article is that, yes, we have a document that says you can have Latin Mass, but in reality, bishops will do things to subvert it. I've seen this myself. She says, the traditional Catholic world has been buzzing with rumors over the past few weeks about Pope Francis and the Vatican moving to restrict Catholics from access to the traditional Latin Mass. The increasingly popular form of the Mass, which was the only Mass every Roman Catholic knew until the liberalizing reforms of Vatican II in the 1970s. After the Second Vatican Council, Catholics who wanted to go to the traditional Latin Mass, also known as the TLM, Old Mass, etc., had limited options. Over the years, and with the establishment of more traditional orders and the institution of more Latin-friendly bishops, the availability of the TLM grew around the world. And as its availability grew, so did its popularity. Young people who hadn't grown up with the Old Mass discovered it and were drawn to its reverence, its grandeur, its otherworldliness. And I can attest to that. I never went to the TLM growing up. I was born in 1988. I say that to age my colleagues at the Crusade Channel. I was born in 1988. By the way, if you've just tuned in, I'm Kennedy Hall, filling in for the King Dude Mike Church, who is on holiday this week. Our call-in telephone number is 1-844-527-8723. The Crusader Stadium chat room is open for your commentary as well at crusadechannel.com/chat, but you got to subscribe in order to access that. If you're watching this in the live stream and you haven't subscribed, stop being a freeloader. I mean that respectfully. Respectfully stop being cheap and a freeloader, and go to crusadechannel.com/go or crusadechannel.com/Kennedy. Sign up, use the coupon code Kennedy so we know where you're coming from. We need hundreds of subscribers in order to make sure that this July 19th launch date will be a cemented and continual reality. Stuff ain't free, people. And the big tech censors are going to come after all of us at some point. So it's time for us to get used to the fact that in order to get the content that we need and the quality content that we need, not just, there's nothing wrong with some guy with a webcam on YouTube, but we're talking about real radio quality broadcasting from dawn till dusk, the best talk shows you can find in North America. You're going to have to go behind a paywall to do that if you want to hear the real truth. We're going to talk about in the second hour about Donald Trump, which you will not hear on YouTube unless you sign up. We're going to talk about Donald Trump suing Facebook and Twitter and other places, which is a big deal. And that has big repercussions. We're also going to have Anthony Stein, who runs Return to Tradition, a wonderful YouTube channel. He's going to come on and scare the pants off us about Catholic prophecy, which is always fun in the second half of the second hour. But we're going to talk about Donald Trump going after big tech. And that's important to keep in mind because big tech is coming after all of us. Big tech is coming off after all of us. It's a matter of time before they do things like say, hey, your YouTube channel, you can't say parts of the Bible on YouTube because they count as discriminatory speech against X, Y, and Z. So you got to go behind a paywall. So if you want to have these sorts of things continue, get ahead of the curve. Go to crusadechannel.com/Kennedy or crusadechannel.com/go. Even easier, you can click the link in the description. I know you're lazy. You're a millennial like me in a lot of cases, and you're lazy. You don't want to type words in. Click the link in the description and sign up to make sure that this new show becomes a long-term reality. Back to the article. On July 2007, Pope Benedict XVI issued a motu proprio called Summorum Pontificum. I won't read this whole part. You've heard the story. Benedict wrote a document. It basically said priests could say the Latin Mass. It was never abrogated. This also vindicated Marcel Lefebvre because his original suspension was him saying that, no, this Mass is not canceled. This was a way of that happening. And you know that it vindicated Marcel Lefebvre because a lot of the liberal modernist bishops got really upset at this because they knew exactly what it meant. Anyway, this was a game changer for the faithful too. And interest in the old Mass exploded. Almost every TLM Catholic can now access in the U.S. an available Latin Mass because of this document. Despite all this and its rumors about an update or rescission of Summorum Pontificum floating around, it's important to note that bishops are still able to restrict the Mass. And this is how they do it. And I've seen this happen before. These are some ways that even though it's technically allowed, because you're under the bishop and the bishop may not like the Mass, this is how he does it. You hear parishioners of a parish offering once a month Latin Mass in a heavily Protestant state with a very small Catholic population were informed that Catholics attending that Latin Mass ought to learn Latin. Parishioners were confused about where this directive came from and why it was being suggested. There is obviously no requirement to know Latin, as most people do not speak Latin and never really have beyond the vulgar state, but definitely not ecclesial Latin. Diocesan coronavirus guideline also banned communion on the tongue, which is the only way communion is received in the TLM. The parish eventually discontinued its Latin Mass altogether. That was one way it was closed. In another instance, college students in another heavily Protestant state were forced to have their visiting priest offer the old Mass in a chemistry classroom rented from the university because the regular Catholic campus ministry wouldn't allow it in the parish church. Under canon law, pastors have quite a bit of say over what goes on in their parish. In this particular diocese, the bishop has tended to name leftist priests and pastors as pastors, thus limiting what young, good, conservative Orthodox priests can do in diocesan churches. In the aforementioned college town, a local priest, not affiliated with the campus ministry, wouldn't let one of his parish churches, a historic church across town, be used for the old Mass, but would allow Protestants to have Sunday liturgies there. Think about that for a second. This could occasionally be overridden by a now deceased retired bishop of the diocese who would inform that priest he planned to offer the old Mass at the church and then would show up and do so to the delight of the tradition-starved faithful. A well-known Catholic community whose parish already has a weekly Sunday TLM is being forced to get permission from their bishop to add a weekly Latin Mass at a convenient time. Does the parish require permission from the bishop if father wants to add another weekday Mass in English? I doubt it. Another one, the rector of a basilica in Florida told a young DC-based couple planning on getting married in their native Sunshine State, quote, "It's very simple. I will not allow a Latin Mass in my church." The priest assured me in the same stroke of his pen that the bishop would support him, and I would do well to not to bother to lobby the bishop. The groom in that situation wrote. The couple with whom I am friends, this is the author speaking, was forced to change wedding locations days before the ceremony. I've seen this before. I saw this with the place that we used to go to Mass before we went over to the society, but we used to go to Mass at a beautiful old church. And eventually the bishop put in a very leftist pastor. So left that it's remarkable that this man is even a Catholic priest. And during the coronavirus restrictions, you see the various cities and the counties and whatever, they have their mask mandates. So we've all heard of these before. Well, there are actually exemptions. I use an exemption every day because you just say you're exempt. And actually, funny enough, the exemptions in the province of Ontario even include your conscience or creed under the Human Rights Tribunal. There's a whole human rights thing. And there's no way of defining what is your creed. So if anyone asks me, my creed is that I'm not a communist. How about that? But in any case, at this parish, they were operating under the mask mandate, but about 80-90% of people wearing masks, and some of them weren't. Well, that's not illegal. That's not illegal. But the parish priest, who was not offering the Mass because it was offered by another priest, the parish priest would sit at the back of the church during Mass, and he would take a tally. A parish priest who was not offering the Mass, was not there to participate in the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, an ordained priest of Jesus Christ, would sit in the back of the church and take a tally of who was wearing a mask and who wasn't. And eventually he said, you know what? Because you guys are such evil, traditionalist, anti-maskers, how dare you? You can no longer have your liturgy here. So Latin Mass at this historic parish, which actually has been preserved. There is a table altar, but it's an old, beautiful German cathedral-style parish. It was for the German Catholics. It's like 120, 130 years old. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Completely intact except for the high altar. Except for the table altars there. There's no communion rail, but everything else is there. There are relics of the True Cross. There are relics of Thomas Aquinas. It is an unbelievable blast from the past when you go into this place. It's an incredible church. You are not allowed to celebrate the Latin Mass there because if you do, you're an anti-masker. So now effectively that Latin Mass community has been put in exile. I think they found some church to offer it somewhere, a remote location. So yeah, sure. Summorum Pontificum gives you the right to say the Latin Mass. But if your bishop happens to say, well, I know you'd like to offer the Latin Mass on Sundays at 2 p.m., but I'm going to put you on a new ministry and it's going to take up the rest of your Sunday. I apologize about that. Or if you have a diocese like we do, where it's 3.5 hours to drive across the bloody thing because it's so big, there are 4 or 5 priests. Well, all of a sudden, these 4 or 5 priests that can say the traditional Mass keep getting sent 2.5 hours away from the population centers. Random how that happens. The article continues. It says, if Summorum Pontificum is indeed axed, it will prove very difficult for tradition-hating prelates to actually abolish the old Mass altogether. In fact, I will add, it will never be abolished because the traditional Mass is the will of God. The traditional Mass is the will of God. The Novus Ordo is not the will of God in an active sense. How do we know this? Because Christ says, by their fruits ye shall know them. I'm going to tell you a little something about that. We talked about in the beginning of the hour with the Vikings coming over to Canada and they planted vineyards. Well, Christ uses the analogy of vineyards. And I grew up making wine with my nonno Giuseppe Vianney, God rest his soul, buonanima. I learned how to make wine as a kid. In fact, I'm sitting in my basement studio, and over behind the wall over there, I've actually got this old handmade wine press that he had made 50 years ago when they came to Canada. In any case, I learned about vineyard cultivation from him. And I actually lived in Italy for a bit as a kid, and I learned things from uncles there, God rest his soul, who died, who himself had an olive grove. He was an olive oil maker, and I had a very traditional experience. It was a wonderful thing. In any case, for these fruit-bearing trees, which include grapes, you have to give it about 40 to 50 years usually before you know if the grape is going to be good. So in those 40 to 50 years, you have some years where you have good crops. You have some years where you have bad crops. This is why people will say, if you go to a vineyard, I was at a vineyard with friends a couple of years ago, and it was a new vineyard here in southwestern Ontario. And I said to my friends, I wonder where they got those grape trees from, those grape bushes. I wonder where they got them from, because they have to be at least 50 years old before they start making a consistent wine. And they said, that's impossible. This vineyard's 3 years old. So we asked a sommelier who was putting on this sort of wine tasting for us and some friends. And she said, we opened this 3 years ago. They were planted 3 years ago. My friend looks at me and he goes, I told you. And she said, but we had to bring them over from France, and they were 48 years old when we got them. And only next year, the 50th year of their existence, can we start using them to make a distinct product. And when Christ says, by their fruits ye shall know them, he's referring to these Mediterranean Levant region olives, grapes, orchards. This is the context of that. And 50 years later, you know the fruits. Well, 50 years later, you know the fruits of what has happened in the church. It's not good. Things that detract from the faith and commit sacrilege are not the will of God. They are not good fruits. Sure, in these last 50 years, has there been the odd good year? Yeah, because with grapes, the odd year, there's a good grape, but then some years it's sour. And we also know from the gospel that after a certain period of time, the trees that bear bad fruit can't be rehabilitated, and they have to be cast down and thrown into the fire. So the Latin Mass will not go away because it's the will of God, and the changes eventually will go away because the fruits are sour, and they are not the will of God. I'm Kennedy, filling in for the King Dude Mike Church, who's on holiday this week. If you're just joining us, at the end of the first hour here, the next hour, we're going to talk about Trump's big announcement. Donald Trump, the Trumpster, he's back in the media again, although he's not on social media, which is why he's suing the social media companies. We're also going to have Anthony Stein on from Return to Tradition. We've got just a minute left here before we go to break. If you are watching on the live stream, click the link in the description to subscribe. Sign up so you can hear more of this radio content that you can't get anywhere else. Uncensored, Catholic conservative talk radio. You won't find anything like this anywhere else on the internet. $10 a month. That's what, 2 coffees at Starbucks. Don't drink as many green tea, soy lattes. Don't drink those anyway, but don't drink them. Sacrifice 2 a month and sign up for the Crusade channel. Click the link in the description to do so. We need hundreds of more subscribers to make this a long-term reality. We will get there. Please join us. Please join us for our Novena to Our Lady of Walsingham, which I will actually put in the chat as we speak. We're going to say this as a group for the success of this new endeavor, but more importantly, or most importantly, we're praying this for a restoration of devotion to Our Lady in England, also everywhere, because we know with the restoration to a devotion to Our Lady that this will have a restoration in the church. I'm Kennedy Hall. I'm filling in for the King Dude Mike Church. We're about to go to break here. If you're watching on Meaning of Catholic, sign up to hear the next hour. We're going to talk about Trump and Catholic prophecy. See you again on the other side of the hour, Crusade Channel subscribers. And here is the top of the hour.